For a little while now, subscribers have been asking for an arcade ports video for the game Thunderblade. Now, anybody who knows how this game controls will likely know why the gameplay footage in this video will be fairly awful. Thunderblade is a game originally with some technical genius behind it. It released in December of 1987, just 4 months after the release of Afterburner, which I've also covered. If the arcade audience were blown away by Afterburner, then Thunderblade took that style to the next level and added 2 perspectives of gameplay rather than just one. The top-down shooter element is impressive in its own right, with a complete freedom of controlling the gunship by flying downwards and upwards to get more precise shot of enemies. It also had scenery and objects appear in complete 3D as we flew by them. The second gameplay perspective is third person, in which we can get to see the gunship making the transition from top down to third person, which is really cool. It's a very impressive game visually for 1987 without a doubt. It is a rail shooter and benefited from Sega's X-board hardware, which Afterburner also used to achieve its gameplay style. Thunderblade was actually based on the 1983 film Blue Thunder. In terms of controls, each platform in this video had its own unique way of controlling the gunship, providing you could master these fairly complex controls per platform. Remember, originally Thunderblade released almost like a simulator with arcade gunship controls rather than the average joystick or 2 to 3 button joypad that computer and console owners had back in the day. I will note here that the 3DS port will not be included, but is highly recommended. So without further ado, let's check out Thunderblade. Perhaps the slowest version or least fluid in terms of scrolling goes to the Amstrad's 1988 US Gold release. Granted, provided you had a colour Amstrad monitor back in the day and not a green monochrome monitor, you would have been likely chuffed with how this looks visually. It's very colourful and the 3D look of scenery looks pretty good here too. But really that's where I draw the line here. This is a ridiculously choppy and laggy game by Tiratex who developed it. They should have had enough knowledge at this point of not having too much happen on screen simultaneously, otherwise frame drops would happen, and happen it did with this Thunderblade's conversion. The gunship controls fairly well and really it looks superb, but the frame drops virtually make it unplayable where it gets so severely choppy. Pretty much from the moment you begin playing this happens. Although the MSX conversion is monochrome and yes it suffers with frame rates, it certainly is a little easier to play than the Amstrad CPC's conversion. Remarkably, just like the next version of this game in the video, the MSX manages to pull off everything extraordinarily well, with fairly basic hardware that is. It controls fairly well and also remains fairly faithful to what it's attempting to achieve, which is obviously the arcade game. It's worth a play if you've not tried this version on the MSX. It's definitely a technical achievement regardless of its slow frame rates. The 1988 ZX Spectrum conversion by US Gold likely doesn't look much today, but for Spectrum users, this port was so good at the time it actually received a Crash Smash award from Spectrum's popular Crash magazine. Sure, the gameplay area is monochrome in visuals, but for anybody who knows how some of the ZX Spectrum games look with its colour clash, then damn, this was a tidy looking release, which providing if you get familiar with its controls, it controls really nicely too. My only real gripe with the Spectrum Sport is that enemies will fire at you relentlessly, quite literally starting from the second the game starts, which makes it fairly challenging, and this is why you will see me die endlessly in the Spectrum gameplay. The sound effects here sound really nice with the gunship's propeller spinning. The transition from top down view to the third person perspective isn't perfection by any means, but it works and we don't have to wait for this to load either. Passing buildings during the top-down sections is simply impressive for a Spectrum game, that's undeniable, especially for a 1988 release. Firstly, the sound for the IBM PC compatible conversion is as can be expected for a DOS game of this era. Not good at all particularly. This 1989 release by Mindscape is fairly playable. Well, at least I actually made it to the end of stage 1 here rather than having hordes of enemy projectiles being flung at me every second. Just like the Spectrum's version, this actually controls really well too. Yes, this can look fairly blocky in terms of scenery and objects in the game, and its example can be seen on the first stage with the buildings. Rather than adding outlines to buildings to give it a more 3D look, the buildings do tend to come across as not moving as we fly past them. But they actually are. Colours used here aren't too bad really for a DOS game of this time. That cool transition from top down to third person perspective isn't here, but conversions will be conversions, and this is one of the sacrifices made for the DOS version. Overall, not a bad Mindscape conversion at all, but again, just like most other versions and the arcade game itself, learning how to control the gunship is a learning curve, that's for sure. The Atari ST reaches the point where colours are beginning to look much more like the arcade game, and of course that's going to be obvious as the ST is a 16-bit computer. Sadly for Atari ST users, although the game looks great visually and totally has the arcade look about it, its main issue here is with the frame drops, which is very annoying. Otherwise this could have been fairly good. I particularly like the skyline during the first stage with the fade in of colours. Again, much like every version, controls are fine provided you can adopt to these, which in most cases I cannot because I have never been too wonderful with this game. The ST pulls off the 3D effect fairly well. In fact, everything is done well, but the very slow pace is really just too laggy to give this version a higher position in this video. Now, whilst playing every version of Thunderblade through this video, I would have to get used to different controller schemes being used in every version. Now, the controller with this Amiga version is nothing more than a nightmare here. I am not sure if it was me or if others also had an issue with this particular version back in the day, but dear lord, I could not even pass the initial top-down stage here. Now, like I say, it is very similar to the Atari ST's version, but this one actually scrolls much smoother and would likely be playable if I had at least a few years to grasp its controller situation. It's extremely unlikely I'll ever return to play this version ever again. Now, I don't get too stressed out with old school difficulty levels, but really this game is just on a completely different level altogether. Now, to be honest, I'm pretty sure this one is a port direct from the Atari ST, although the colours do tend to look slightly better with the Amiga version. Released in 1989 by US Gold, this was clearly a game that the Commodore 64 shouldn't have been able to pull off as well as it did, but it did to some extent. It's not the most visually attractive C64 game out there, but everything here remains fairly faithful to the arcade game, and that's undeniable there. I really wasn't expecting much for the C64's conversion, and that's likely because in most of my arcade ports videos, the Commodore 64 generally had the superior sounds with abysmal visuals. That definitely isn't the case with Thunderblade. This not only features the excellent music, but also the excellent visuals to complement that too, as well as the fast-paced scrolling. The Commodore 64 was relatively slow for pulling off 3D style games, Castle Master for example, but this one actually nailed it. Although, just like the arcades game, this is tough without a doubt. It just does everything right here though, and even feels good to control, offering the player the same freedoms of movement for the gunship as the arcade game itself. It's a sad day when a mere 8-bit microcomputer can play better than its updated 16-bit brother. The Sega Master System's conversion is fairly bare bones, and we no longer have the ability to move up and down with the 3D perspective during the top-down stages. Scenery below is static, so it doesn't move to change perspective of buildings, for example. It does come across as a generic top-down vertical shoot-'em-up, and then the third-person perspective kicks in, and that Thunderblade look begins to take effect. It's a very smooth game and even utilises the Sega Master System's FM sound unit expansion, which actually enhances how the game sounds. It plays fairly well, and I'm confident that Sega, who published this one, knew the limitations of the Master System's hardware and so didn't want to overdo it. It's of course not the most faithful looking arcade conversion in this list, but it does have an element of playability, and the gunship is fairly easy to control too. Although there is some sacrifices with the PC Engine's 1990 NEC Avenue release, the game is just much simpler to control than most versions here, much like the Sega Master System's port. Although most conversions, in my opinion, had faithful controls which were just as bizarre and a steep learning curve to master just an arcade game, the controller scheme with this version was just much more simplified and user-friendly. Yes, still tricky, but much easier than the previous versions minus the Master System's port. The major cutback here is when we fly the gunship towards the ground. This version doesn't zoom in like every other version as you're going downwards. It is a culture shock at this point of recording because I got so used to this, but having said that, it just seems much easier to play than most other versions. If you love Thunderblade, much like myself, but cannot stand the controls used, then this is definitely the version to go for. The second sequence, or rather the third person perspective, is fairly nice here, with a nice transition going from top down to third person perspective. Overall, a good and fairly smooth game. So we go from the style of being okay and playable to this arcade perfect Sharp X68000 conversion direct from Sharp Corporation, releasing way back in 1990. For those of you who know the arcades game well, you'll undoubtedly agree that this home conversion is by far the best of everything in this video. It controls extremely well and doesn't seem too overly complicated to get to grips with either. It scrolls beautifully and really is much like the arcades game in every sense from what I've played of it. If I didn't know better, I would assume that this was actually the arcades game, which it clearly isn't. But Thunderblade purists could probably pick a fault with that statement I just made. And that's it for today's ranking the Thunderblade ports. So, which version did you grow up with? Did you have the awesome Commodore 64 version? Undoubtedly a very good port for the 8-bit micro. Let us know, as always, in the comments section down below. And did you actually agree with the Sharp 68000 taking first place here? But anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.